Tonight I want to pay special attention to a friend of mine, Taraji P. Henson, are truly amazing. You told me that I reminded you of someone, your father. I wish he could be here to see you today. And if I could be so bold as to speak for him. Listen to me, TJ. You have made my heart glad.
The headline flashed across screens like a warning light. Terrence Howard sends a warning after Taraji P. Henson is blackballed. It sounded like a movie teaser, powerful, cryptic, loaded with tension. What could Terrence Howard possibly be warning about? And how serious was this blackballing of Taraji P. Henson? On one side stood Taraji P. Henson, a Hollywood heavyweight, an Oscar-nominated actress beloved by fans worldwide. On the other side was Terrence Howard, a seasoned actor known as much for his on-screen intensity as for the controversies that followed him off-screen. What had triggered this public statement? The video opens with Terrence Howard in a somber, setting low lighting, a serious tone. As he leans into the camera, his words seem to carry far more than a casual opinion. There is anger, there is frustration, and above all, a sense of urgency. The kind of tone that suggests something has gone very wrong, something not just career-ending, but possibly life-changing for Taraji P. Henson, who had just been rumored to be blackballed in Hollywood. The stakes felt existential. A warning from Terrence Howard suggested that her struggles might be part of something bigger: industry politics, influence, retaliation, or something darker. What followed was a public fallout that would unearth old conflicts, test alliances, and force both actors to respond not just as individuals, but as symbols in a larger struggle. In this video, we're peeling back the layers, exploring what led up to Taraji's blackballing, what Terrence Howard actually said, how Hollywood reacted, and what the fallout could mean for both of their careers and for the entertainment industry as a whole. The story begins months earlier. Behind closed doors in Hollywood boardrooms, production meetings, and whispered conversations on set, reports began to circulate that Taraji P. Henson was being quietly pushed out of casting calls, production meetings, and studio pipelines. Agents allegedly stopped returning her calls, and scripts that once seemed ready for her signature suddenly stalled. The term blackballing started floating around, but proving it, that was something else entirely. Taraji's recent outspoken comments about diversity, pay inequality, and casting practices had made waves. Some rallied behind her, but others bristled at the spotlight she was shining on industry practices. Behind the scenes, she was reportedly labeled difficult or too outspoken, and a few insiders whispered that executives didn't want to jeopardize their relationships by supporting someone who was seen as a liability. The tension escalated when a key producer pulled her from a major film project, citing creative differences. Taraji's camp saw it as something more explicit. A warning shot a message that her outspokenness might come at a cost. When Terrence Howard stepped in publicly, it shocked many. Howard had been relatively quiet during this period, but he had also been a vocal advocate for crediting Black creators in the industry. His unexpected message was, at first, vague. He said that he had warned Taraji that pushing too hard against powerful studio forces could have consequences. But what did he mean by warning? And did Taraji's blackballing follow that push? Was Terrence issuing the warning in hindsight, or had he tried to intervene? Howard's public statement came during a live-streamed Q&A session, where he was asked bluntly whether the rumors about Taraji's career trouble were true. He paused, sighed, and said, "There are things in Hollywood that are not spoken, that people don't want you to know. I warned her. I told her that some connections are deeper than roles, they are politics." As he spoke, his expression hardened, and the seriousness in his voice made it clear. This wasn't just industry gossip. He was pointing to something more systemic. Within hours, clips of Howard's statement were spreading across YouTube, Twitter, and Instagram. Analysts and commentators began racing to untangle this sequence of events. Taraji's activism gives Terrence's warning gives Taraji's alleged blackballing. Some interpreted Howard's words as a self-fulfilling prophecy, suggesting that his warning foreshadowed what he saw coming. Others argued that his statement was more of a confession that he had tried to warn her, but ultimately failed to prevent what he knew was coming. Either way, the public was left with one question. If he warned her, what did he predict or foresee? Taraji's response when it came was cautious but pointed. On a media tour, she said she was not surprised by some of the pushback she'd faced, but that she refused to back down from the issues she cared about: representation, equality, and speaking truth to power. She framed the blackballing not as a personal failure, but as a symptom of a system that penalizes those who challenge it. Her tone suggested not anger, but determination, and a belief that the conversation needed to continue whether or not Hollywood came along at this point. The story shifted. This was no longer just about one actress or one career. It became a question of how Hollywood manages dissent, how much power studios and executives have, and what happens to actors who cross the unspoken lines. If Taraji was being punished for her outspokenness, what did that warning from Terrence Howard really signal? Had she been forewarned by a friend, by a colleague, or by someone with connections about the system she was up against? And if so, was that warning a help or a harbinger? Terrence Howard's statement was just the spark. What followed was a firestorm. Industry insiders began sharing their own stories of blackballing, being labeled difficult, of watching younger talent get replaced under pressure. Actors, writers, and directors took to social media to share anonymous accounts of conversations where they were told, "You'll never work again if you push back." The term blackballing suddenly had a wider resonance, touching not just Taraji's case, but a broader tension between artists and studios. As for Taraji, the blackballing became more evident. Projects she had been attached to quietly removed her name. Production schedules shifted. Instead of walking red carpets, she began attending panel discussions about representation and pay equity. Meanwhile, streaming series with similar themes but featuring other actors moved forward, raising questions about whether the industry was steering stories and casting away from those who spoke. Out, Howard's involvement drew fresh scrutiny. Many asked, had he been trying to warn Taraji before she was blackballed, or had he been warning the industry to stay away from her? Some of his critics suggested the warning was patronizing or worse, complicit. If he had warned her that speaking out could bring a backlash, was he inadvertently telling her to stay quiet? Or was he trying to prepare her for the fight ahead? Two leaks added fuel to the fire. First, a private text exchange allegedly between Taraji and Howard surfaced, showing that Howard had texted her weeks before the public warning saying, "You're rattling the cages. Are you ready for what's coming?" Taraji allegedly replied, "I know the risk." But silence is not an option. The second leak was a confidential email from a studio executive, stating that her public statements have made her a risk to attach to big-budget projects together. These leaks framed a narrative of inevitability. Taraji had pushed. The industry responded. And Howard's warning, far from being preventative, looked like something foreboding, something that had foreshadowed the very outcome. She was heading toward public opinion split. Fans rallied around Taraji, praising her for taking a stand and calling out Hollywood's hypocrisy. They saw Howard as a protector, a friend who tried to warn her that the establishment might bite back. But others expressed frustration. They accused her of making career decisions that risked her standing in the industry. They wondered whether the fight was worth the personal cost. And for some, Terrence Howard's public statement was viewed as overly dramatic or even self-serving, raising questions about whether he was trying to elevate his own profile in the process. As the tension escalated, Taraji did something unexpected. She began hosting a series of online discussions and workshops about speaking out, about negotiating deals, about knowing your worth. These sessions were raw, emotional, and honest. She discussed how she had found herself shut out of projects she was excited about, how she had been told to soften her message, and how the teams around her seemed to shift once she became vocal. She also talked about the toll it took on her mental health, anxiety, sleeplessness, and the fear that speaking the truth would cost her everything she had worked for. cost her everything she had worked for. Terrence, for his part, remained somewhat in the shadows after the initial warning. He was invited to appear on talk shows to explain his statement, but often declined. When he did speak, he emphasized that his intention had never been to silence Taraji, but rather to highlight the real price of dissent in Hollywood. "My hope," he said in one interview, was that Taraji would be prepared, that she would continue, not because it would be easy, but because it would be worth it. The ambiguity of his remarks between warning and support remained a central theme in the discussion. The complexity of Hollywood, of fame, and of resistance became clearer. Taraji's blackballing was not portrayed as a simple punishment for speaking out, but as part of a larger negotiation between artists and the institutions that fund them, between personal integrity and professional survival, and between the voices we want to hear and the ones that industry is willing to risk. The question became, can an artist be outspoken and still thrive? Or does the system enforce its boundaries through exclusion? As the controversy continued to unfold, Taraji P. Henson took the message from her blackballing as a challenge, and she began to turn it into opportunity. The workshops she hosted gained traction, attracting other actors, writers, and fans who had experienced similar pushback. She formed a coalition advocating for transparent contract negotiations, quittable pay, and the right to speak publicly without fear of career reprisal. The movement grew organically, fueled by social media and first-person stories. Taraji wasn't just fighting for herself anymore. She was fighting for a shift in how Hollywood treated its outspoken talent. Terrence Howard, once a peripheral figure in the discussion, was drawn more deeply into the spotlight. Vestiges of his initial warning began to be reinterpreted. Some came to see him as a misunderstood ally, someone trying to open a difficult conversation about systemic backlash. Others remained skeptical, viewing him as a figure who could have done more, or perhaps should have done more, to protect Taraji's career. Howard's dual role as friend and forecaster raised questions about what it means to be a warning voice in a system built on silence. Meanwhile, studios and executives felt the pressure. Conversations about blackballing could no longer be whispered. Some publicly pledged to review internal practices related to diversity and creative risk. Others quietly issued apologies or reached out to Taraji in attempts at reconciliation. But many remained silent, prompting critics to demand structural change, not just surface-level gestures. The debate shifted from, was Taraji blackballed, to, what does it mean when a powerful artist is effectively silenced? And what message does that send to anyone who dares to speak? The discussion spilled beyond Hollywood. Journalists, scholars, and cultural critics began referencing Taraji's case in broader debates about cancel culture, freedom of expression, and the cost of activism. The idea that speaking truth to power could end one's career were coding conversations about politics, journalism, and art. The Taraji and Howard story became a cautionary tale, but also, potentially, a blueprint for resistance. Taraji's personal trajectory, while uncertain, turned toward resilience. She began collaborating with independent filmmakers, choosing projects that aligned with her values over those guaranteed to succeed financially. She spoke at universities and conferences, offering advice and empathy to young artists who felt trapped by the industry. She wrote an essay collection, blending memoir, critique, and calls to action. In every public appearance, she carried the scars of her blackballing, but also the fire of her conviction. She no longer saw her exclusion as a loss. She saw it as a redirection. Terrence Howard's role continued to provoke debate. He became the subject of think pieces and op-eds. Was Howard's warning an act of care or capitulation? Did his statement help Taraji or warn her to stay silent? Some argued that by voicing his concerns, he had modeled what it means to stand with someone while still acknowledging the danger. Others suggested that his warning was a form of distancing, a way to acknowledge the problem without fully embracing the consequences. Howard himself offered no definitive answers, often returning to the idea that power in Hollywood is a high-stakes game that punishes truth-tellers. He urged young actors to speak up, but also to be prepared for fallout by the end of the year. A new narrative had taken hold. Taraji P. Henson was no longer defined by blackballing, but by her response to it. She had transformed public perception from victim to movement leader, from controversy to catalyst. The warning from Terrence, once seen as ominous, became a map, a lesson in what resistance looks like when the odds are stacked. The conversation about blackballing and creative risk continued, but now it included hope, strategy, and solidarity, and just loss and fear in the end. The story of Taraji's blackballing and Terrence Howard's warning became a story of friction, not of downfall, of emergence. What might have broken her career instead became the foundation of her next chapter. Her message, once considered controversial, now resonated in conversations about power, truth, and survival. It wasn't just about what Hollywood took. It was about what she refused to let Hollywood take. And as Terrence Howard's warning echoed through those first moments, the lesson became clearer: when you choose to not stay silent, you might lose a lot, but you might also spark something new. Something larger than any role or studio could contain.